It was a quiet Thursday evening at the office. Most employees had already trickled out for the day, leaving behind the low hum of computers and the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights overhead. Karoline Leavitt, known for her relentless work ethic and late-night dedication, was gathering her belongings after wrapping up a strategy session. As she stepped out of the conference room, she paused for a moment near the main hallway, stretching out her sore shoulders and mentally preparing for the briefcase full of reports awaiting her at home. The silence of the office was suddenly broken, not by footsteps or the clatter of cleaning equipment, but by a voice. A melodic, fluid stream of words, spoken softly but confidently, echoed down the corridor. At first, Karoline didn't catch the language. It was definitely not English. The tone and rhythm felt unfamiliar. Curious, she took a few quiet steps in the direction of the voice. As she drew closer to the source, the speech shifted. This time to something that sounded vaguely familiar. French, clear, articulate, almost poetic in delivery. Karoline froze in place, her ears sharpened by curiosity. Within moments, the voice shifted again. A new language, sharp consonants, tonal fluctuations. Mandarin, perhaps. Karoline wasn't fluent, but she recognized enough from diplomatic briefings and international meetings to tell that this wasn't just mimicry. The speaker was fluent. Seamless transitions from one language to another, switching with ease, tone, and confidence. It wasn't rehearsed, wasn't robotic. It was natural. She remained still, almost afraid to move, not wanting to interrupt the flow. Whoever it was, they weren't aware they had an audience. The words continued, this time in something sounding like Arabic, smooth and rhythmic. Karoline blinked, her mind racing. Her surroundings began to fade into the background as the words created a strange sense of wonder. This wasn't some casual polyglot showing off. This was someone speaking with familiarity, even affection. It was like listening to a musician transition effortlessly between instruments in a private concert no one else knew was happening. The voice dropped into something else next, perhaps Russian, then Portuguese, and still, no notes, no script. The speaker wasn't reading or translating, it was free-form speech, fluid and without hesitation. Karoline leaned slightly around the corner. The area appeared empty, just the faint scent of citrus cleaning supplies hanging in the air. She didn't yet see the speaker, but she knew this wasn't ordinary. Her instincts as a communicator kicked in. She had given speeches in packed halls, debated on live television, and held her own in high-stakes political negotiations. But this quiet, almost hidden display of mastery, it stirred something different. Not adrenaline, not strategy, but admiration. This wasn't learned for show. This was lived. She stepped back, trying to process what she was witnessing. In all her years in politics and business, she had encountered world leaders who could barely string together two languages without interpreters. And yet, here in her office building, after hours, someone was moving effortlessly through at least 6, possibly more, as if it were second nature. The question clawed at her. Who had this kind of linguistic range, and why was it unfolding unnoticed, unrecognized after most had already gone home? It wasn't for an audience, it wasn't being recorded, it was just happening, freely, casually. And yet, it carried the weight of someone who had seen things, been places, lived lives within cultures she could only read about. Karoline didn't interrupt. Not yet. She chose to listen, quietly, respectfully, allowing each language to wash over her. Her mind began calculating, not out of habit, but out of instinct. This was rare, more than rare, it was extraordinary. And it was happening right under her nose in the most unassuming of settings, without warning or fanfare. She stepped back into the shadow of a column, just out of sight, her heart beating a little faster now. This wasn't just some curiosity. It felt like a door had cracked open into something deeper, something quietly powerful. And Karoline knew in that moment that the night had shifted. She wasn't going home just yet. Karoline returned to the office the next morning with a sense of anticipation she hadn't expected. The echoes of the previous night still lingered in her thoughts. Every syllable, every graceful shift between languages had carved itself into her memory like a secret that refused to stay hidden. There was something about that moment that wouldn't let her go. It wasn't just the linguistic skill, it was the way it had been expressed. Calm, effortless, almost sacred. As she walked the halls with her coffee in hand, Karoline replayed what she had heard. Over the years, she had worked alongside diplomats, campaign strategists, and policy analysts who each brought their own impressive credentials to the table. But what she heard last night hadn't been learned in a classroom or rehearsed for political theater. It had the unmistakable tone of someone who had absorbed the soul of each culture, someone who had lived it. Throughout the morning, her meetings went on as scheduled. Policy reviews, regional strategy updates, internal communications briefings, it all blurred together. And yet, behind her calm exterior, her mind drifted. She couldn't help but scan the edges of each room, searching for something, or rather, someone whose identity still eluded her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she had been in the presence of someone remarkable, hidden in plain sight. Most people she knew who possessed such skills wore them like medals, highlighted, on resume, tossed into conversation to command respect. But the voice from last night had shown no such ego. There was no boasting, no posturing. It wasn't for show, and that's what made it all the more powerful. It was humble mastery, something that rarely surfaced in a world where image often outweighed substance. By mid-afternoon, Karoline's curiosity had grown into something sharper. Not suspicion, but responsibility. She had spent much of her professional life pushing for merit to be recognized over connections. She knew the dangers of overlooking talent just because it didn't come packaged in a tailored suit or prestigious title. She had seen brilliance silenced in boardrooms, and here was a living example of it, moving quietly, unseen by most, yet speaking the languages of the world like they were threads in a tapestry only a few knew how to weave. She began asking gentle, subtle questions, nothing direct. Just general inquiries about office routines, cleaning schedules, who typically stayed late. The answers were vague, mostly unhelpful, but that didn't stop her. It wasn't about uncovering a mystery out of nosiness. It was about recognizing something special that, for too long, had gone unnoticed. What struck her most was the contrast. The juxtaposition between the setting, an ordinary office, linoleum floors, quiet conference rooms, and the profound intelligence she had heard echo through those halls. In most places, someone like that would be courted by think tanks, interviewed by international outlets, offered high-ranking posts. And yet here, the genius was invisible. No applause, no recognition. Just quiet work and unassuming presence. Karoline began thinking back to the stories she'd heard growing up, of immigrants who came to America with PhDs and ended up driving taxis, of war refugees who once led universities and were now stocking shelves in grocery stores. Life had a way of burying brilliance under survival, and if no one looked closely enough, that brilliance stayed buried. There was something profoundly moving in the thought that someone so capable had remained silent for so long. Not because they lacked the words, but because no one had ever asked. No one had ever listened. It was a sobering realization. In a world obsessed with titles and credentials, the most extraordinary minds could be hiding behind the most ordinary roles. And that, more than the languages, more than the mystery, was what stayed with her. The quiet strength, the humility, the acceptance of a role beneath one's capacity, not out of laziness or failure, but out of necessity. It was a quiet dignity, the kind that made you stop and reconsider how many times you'd walked past someone without ever truly seeing them. Karoline had built her career on perception, intuition, and sharp judgment. But this unseen brilliance, masked behind routine, challenged her. It forced her to reflect on how much talent is missed not because it's hidden, but because it doesn't scream for attention. It simply is. The next morning unfolded with a sense of purpose unlike any other. Karoline arrived earlier than usual, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor with precision. There was a certain energy to her stride, controlled, deliberate, but charged with quiet excitement. She had made a decision the night before, one she knew might raise a few eyebrows, possibly even spark whispers. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the opportunity that now lay within reach, unnoticed by everyone else in the building. The leadership team was scheduled to meet at 10. It was a quarterly review, typically dry, dominated by financial charts, market projections, and carefully rehearsed updates. Karoline had attended dozens of them, sometimes leading, sometimes observing. Today, however, she intended to change the entire dynamic. Her mind wasn't on spreadsheets. It was on the silent moment that had revealed itself days earlier in a darkened hallway, a moment that had haunted her ever since. As she entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was as formal as always. Polished table, water pitchers, nameplates, and the obligatory aroma of catered coffee. The room buzzed with the quiet tension of professionals preparing to present their best. Suits straightened, notepads opened, tablet screens lit up. But Karoline, calm and focused, sat at the head of the table with an expression that hinted she had something else in mind. She didn't start with the agenda. Instead, she looked around the table, pausing just long enough to make each person feel seen. Then, with a voice both measured and confident, she said she was bringing in someone new. Someone not on the invite list. The reaction was almost immediate. Subtle glances exchanged, puzzled expressions, a few raised eyebrows. It was a break in protocol, and in this environment, that rarely happened without good reason. The door opened. There was a collective turn. Of heads, some trying to disguise their surprise. The energy in the room shifted, slightly uncertain, teetering between curiosity and skepticism. Karoline remained composed. She gestured toward an empty chair near the end of the table. The newcomer took the seat without hesitation, not fidgeting, not overwhelmed, just calm, poised. Without delay, Karoline handed over a set of international documents the team had been struggling to decode for weeks. Government releases, trade agreements, technical memos, all written in languages that typically required third-party consultants or translation software. She asked if anyone at the table had managed to get through them accurately. A few shrugged, others glanced at their notes, uncomfortable. She then turned to the guest and asked, softly, if they'd be willing to offer a summary. What happened next felt like a cinematic scene unfolding in real time. The room fell still. One by one, each document was not just translated, but interpreted. Context given, idioms explained, legal nuances unpacked with surgical precision. The tone was clear, confident, and far from rehearsed. It was obvious to everyone within minutes that they weren't just listening to someone who understood words. They were listening to someone who understood meaning. The executives who moments earlier had looked skeptical were now leaning forward, pens frozen in midair. No one interrupted. No one dared. What they were witnessing wasn't just fluency. It was expertise, delivered with humility, precision, and insight. One of the international contracts had been misinterpreted by the firm's legal department just days earlier. The correction offered at the table with supporting rationale saved what could have been a seven-figure misstep. By the time the final document was discussed, the room had undergone a quiet transformation. The atmosphere wasn't just respectful, it was reverent. The silence spoke volumes. Eyes that had once judged were now widened with recognition. They weren't just seeing someone new, they were seeing someone extraordinary. And Karoline, seated at the head of the table, didn't need to say a word. Her actions had spoken louder than any speech she could have prepared. She had taken a risk. She had broken formality, gone against expectations, and trusted her instincts. But in doing so, she had uncovered something irrefutable. True talent doesn't need a podium. It only needs a moment. And sometimes, the most important decisions a leader can make aren't the ones that come from data or policy, but the ones that come from paying attention when no one else is watching. The atmosphere in the office shifted subtly over the following days. Not in the way corporate changes often send ripples, no public announcements, no emails, no meetings with fanfare, but something more organic, more human. People noticed a different rhythm in the way things moved. There was a newfound attentiveness in how colleagues greeted one another, a little more care in the conversations that once felt rushed or transactional. Something had changed, and it began with Karoline. She wasn't the kind of leader who acted for spectacle. Her moves were precise, purposeful, often invisible until their impact became impossible to ignore. And now, her quiet decision had turned an unacknowledged moment into a lesson that the entire building, from the highest-ranking executive to the newest intern, felt in their bones. It wasn't just about bringing someone into a meeting or showcasing a skill that had long gone unnoticed. It was about disrupting the unspoken assumptions that governed so many workplaces. For years, roles had defined people, titles, desks, departments, but that division, that silent hierarchy, had been exposed as shallow. A single decision had challenged the myth that value is found only at the top of the organizational chart. Whispers started, not the kind rooted in gossip, but the kind sparked by awe. The kind that begins with a "did you hear about?" and ends with a pause, a shake of the head, and a newfound appreciation for the unseen. People who had walked past one another daily without a glance now exchanged hellos. Others looked more closely at those around them, wondering what stories had gone unheard, what talents had gone unrecognized, simply because no one had thought to look deeper. Karoline didn't gloat. There was no need. What mattered to her wasn't being right, it was being fair. It was proving, through action, that leadership meant more than delegating tasks or chairing meetings. It meant uncovering potential where others failed to notice it. She had always believed that talent, like character, reveals itself in quiet ways, but belief is one thing, action is another. Now, she had acted. In the days that followed, she made a habit of walking different routes through the building. She stopped for longer conversations in the break room, asked questions that others would have ignored, and sat in on meetings that rarely included her. Not to hover, not to micromanage, but to observe, to listen, to remind herself and others that greatness didn't always knock. Sometimes it whispered from the corners of the room. There were changes in the way team members approached their own roles too. Those who once felt invisible now carried themselves with a little more pride. A few even took the bold step of speaking up in meetings they would have once sat through silently. Others asked for cross-departmental training, emboldened by the idea that their capabilities might stretch further than their job descriptions allowed. The entire office, without realizing it, was starting to operate from a place of possibility. Karoline knew that the ripple effects of this shift would last, far longer than the initial moment. It had created a crack in the surface of routine, a small but permanent reminder that people carry hidden dimensions and that power lies not in hierarchy, but in humanity. She had always trusted her gut, but this time, her instinct had revealed something transformative. As new projects rolled out, she looked for ways to embed this ethos more deeply. Anonymous idea boxes appeared on each floor. Language courses were offered over lunch. A mentorship program was launched, not between executives and managers, but between departments that rarely interacted. She insisted on reviewing internal applications herself, just in case a resume missed what a conversation might reveal. Some viewed it as soft leadership. She didn't mind. What others called soft, she knew was strong. It takes strength to see beyond appearances. It takes courage to champion someone before others believe in them. And it takes vision to understand that titles may reflect structure, but they don't always reflect worth. What had begun as a quiet moment in a hallway had grown into something more. A shift in culture, a story that would be told and retold, not for drama, but for inspiration. A testament to what happens when someone chooses to see, really see, the people around them, not just for what they do, but for who they are and what they carry beneath the surface. Karoline stood by her office window as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting a soft golden hue across the glass. The once familiar office around her now felt different, not because the walls had changed, but because the people inside them had. What began as a quiet decision, a simple act of attention, had blossomed into a wave of transformation that no press release could have engineered, no consultant could have predicted. She thought about how easy it is to overlook people, especially in fast-paced environments where efficiency often trumps empathy. How many times had she walked those same halls, nodded politely, but never truly stopped to see beyond a name tag or job title? And how many others had done the same? But now, the tone of the office had shifted. People had started asking more questions, not just about reports or timelines, but about one another. Conversations had grown deeper, more respectful. The atmosphere was no longer just professional, it was personal. What made this change so profound wasn't that it came from a top-down directive or some formal diversity initiative. It came from something far more powerful: recognition. The kind of recognition that doesn't need applause or spotlight. The kind that happens quietly, between two people, one who sees and one who, for the first time in a long time, feels seen. She realized then that leadership isn't about how loudly you speak, it's about how deeply you listen. It's about noticing the extraordinary in the ordinary and having the courage to elevate it, even when others might not understand why. It's about dismantling assumptions and making room at the table for voices long ignored. As she turned away from the window and walked through the office one last time that evening, the subtle nods and warm glances from coworkers weren't just acknowledgments of her role. They were acknowledgments of her choice, to believe in someone others had passed by, to trust her instinct when logic offered no precedent, and to act not for applause, but because it was simply the right thing to do. In that act, she hadn't just changed one life, she'd changed many. She'd reminded an entire organization, and perhaps even herself, that brilliance doesn't always wear a nameplate. Sometimes it carries a mop bucket, sometimes it walks in silence, and sometimes all it needs to shine is for someone to ask the question no one else thought to ask. The moment had passed, but its message would linger. And for Karoline, that was